Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. Our first roundtable of the day is titled Feminist Political Media, the Emergence, Influence, and Role, moderated by Professor Brittney Cooper. Brittney is an associate professor in women's and gender studies and Africana studies here at Rutgers, where she teaches courses on Black feminist theory, Black intellectual thought, hip-hop, and gender in media. Brittney is also the co-founder of Crunk Feminist Collective and blog. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So it is my honor and pleasure to kick us off for the day after that rousing keynote that was very clarifying and helps us to sort of imagine the stakes. And so now we want to get crunk and really talk. So I also really can't do this without calling the name of Allison Bernstein. I miss her greatly. She was one of my biggest cheerleaders when I got here and pulled me into all kinds of things, but it was a lovely education. And so we do this for you, Allison. It is my pleasure to also introduce to you two of my favorite feminist media figures and writers in this moment. I go to their work to help me make sense of, I won't start cussing yet, okay, but I might start soon. So to my far left, Rebecca Traister is writer at large for New York Magazine and the author of the New York Times bestseller, All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women and the Rise of an Independent Nation. It's an amazing book, please pick it up, which was recently named a notable book of 2016 by the New York Times. Her previous book, Big Girls Don't Cry, was the Times Notable Book of 2010 and the winner of the Ernesta Drinker Ballard Book Prize. She has also written for Elle, Salon, The Nation, The New Republic, The Washington Post, and The New York Observer, and has twice been a National Magazine Award finalist. She is a winner of the 2016 Hillman Prize for Analysis and Opinion Journalism, and she lives in New York City. Welcome, Rebecca. And to my immediate left is Jamia Wilson, a leading voice on feminist and women's rights issues whose work and words have appeared in and on the New York Times, New York Magazine, Teen Vogue, Refinery 29, Elle, ABC, TED, she bad, The Guardian, The Today Show, CNN, Bust, The Washington Post, and more. She's the executive director of Women Action and the Media and a columnist for Rookie Magazine. Wilson has contributed to several books, including Madonna and Me, Women Writers on the Queen of Pop, The V Word, Slut, the Play, When Grace Meets Power, and I Still Believe Anita Hill. She recently wrote an amazing cover story on Solange for Bust magazine, and I urge you to check it out.
Thank you.
So let's get started. Okay, so we can so this panel is about feminist political media. And I have lots of questions about the state of feminism, about what y'all think media has to do with it. And so I want to begin with a Hillary question, but we won't just talk about Hillary. So the primary analysis of this moment as we try to understand what the hell happened has been, when I've read, about the ways that race and class shaped the election of 2016. So we've gotten a narrative that this is white resentment. We've gotten a narrative that this is class anxiety from white working class voters. But I wonder about what you guys think about the gender analysis of this moment. Because there was this sense about Hillary Clinton on the one hand when we talked about feminism in relationship to her, that she was either so much like a white man that she didn't inspire any feminist feel-good moments in younger feminists, or that among the less or among the more jaded, so that was the sort of young folks narrative. The kind of the narrative of folks who were older and more experienced was simply that she was a shoo-in and that feminism really didn't have anything to do with whether they would vote one way or the other. So I wonder, do you all think that, how might our gender analysis have been better in the 2016 election coverage?
Yeah, I would like to start with you because I know you've done some great writing on this and also profiled her directly on the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question for me to answer only because I feel like I've spent 10 years writing about gender analysis of Hillary Clinton, and so I'm trying to think of like an entry point that's neat and works efficiently. I mean, I think that broad media gender analysis of Hillary Clinton and how she's been understood throughout her career has always been lacking. We like to keep our questions about gender and race and class really simple. And so I recently had a conversation with a very prominent editor in journalism who said, so do you think she lost because of sexism? Like, we want easy approaches, and then if the answer is too complicated, which of course it is, then you move away from it rather than linger on it and take it apart more. And so, you know, and the other entry point to this conversation is often, and I think we see this all over the media, certainly television, cable news, certainly in major newspapers, which really lacked much feminist coverage or much coverage of gender and Hillary Clinton. I mean, if you read the New York Times on Hillary Clinton over the past 2 years, you are going to find precious little analysis of how gender might have been a factor when we had the first woman nominated by a major party. 2.5 centuries, one woman. And where were the in-depth pieces in the major newspapers? I mean, a lot of people in this room were writing about gender, race, class, but not necessarily in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, and certainly not with any regularity.
Sure.
Right? So you're lacking this lens that applies every day, right? Every minute of every day in all kinds of directions. And we're not looking at anything through that lens in our major news sources. Mm-hmm. And then we also, so many people in my industry succumb to this, also an easy way to not have the conversation, that it's not about women, it's about that woman, right? The particulars of Hillary Clinton, you know, as you point out, the ways in which she is either so much like a white man or is part of an establishment, or is too attached to big money, to count. I mean, even the casting of her as a member of the establishment is fascinating, right? Because the history of women running for president, the complaints and the reasons that they haven't had access to presidential politics and to opportunities within presidential politics, and they've said it. Shirley Chisholm spoke about, I couldn't get the money. It was money. It was established, it was the support of the Democratic establishment. I couldn't get it. You know, that's what Pat Schroeder talks about. She couldn't get the money. So you finally have a woman who figures out the way around those roadblocks that have been in place for centuries and gets the money and gets the establishment support. And interestingly enough, at that point, her attachments to the money and the establishment become the liabilities, right? Then that's what disqualifies her, not only from popular support, but even from being a woman, right? She's not an outsider anymore. Never mind that she's the only woman to have gotten this close. She is the ultimate insider. It was a really neat sort of inversion. And we didn't take apart, none of that was sort of broken apart in a daily or regular way, like what that means. That doesn't mean that it was wrong to have anxiety about the fact that she gave Goldman Sachs speeches, right? That's a correct thing to have anxiety about. But the way in which we easily skidded over how it was working against her in ways that it has perhaps not worked against other people who have come before her, we just could never get past the idea that everything here was about Hillary Clinton and her own baggage, her own, and, you know, so we don't have to think, oh, we have a problem with women in this country. We just had a problem with Hillary Clinton, but we never get to that next step, which is like, okay, so how come Hillary Clinton is the only one we got so far? Who got this far?
That's right.
Right? Okay, so she's that woman. How'd that woman become the only one?
That's right.
The only one.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, fire, bring it. That's right. That's right. But Jamia, one of the things I'm thinking as I'm listening to Rebecca, though, is that it's also that Hillary Clinton was not quite right on many things. She was more than not quite right sometimes. And so how do we deal in this moment, too, with, like, I'm thinking about feminist. So one of the things I'm thinking, Rebecca, as I'm listening to you, is I'm thinking, your call for complex analysis is interesting in a moment where the most woke media seems to be speaking at a level that is above where much of the American public is, right? So we're told that we're out of step and that people are not trying to hear our intersectional conversation because they don't know what intersectionality is. And so I want to know, Jamia, why do you think it has been so hard to advance the conversation about intersectionality, about this concept that for us in the academy is old by now, is out of date, but is still really new to the people who read us? Like, how can feminist political media help to make that conversation more accessible, not just to young people who want to be woke, but to a broader audience?
I think about this a lot because I think that the concept is actually very simple, the concept of intersectionality. And after being in progressive spaces or even hearing other people who train people in media and white media trainers say things like, oh, you can't use words like intersectionality in media because then you'll confuse people or you'll decentralize yourself and lose your base. I actually think that that's a form of gaslighting, but also it's about a fear of decentering their own power and privilege. So the question that I like to ask now, which has not won me any friends, but I think has provoked some good responses and thoughtfulness, has been, what is your fear? What do you think you might lose if people were to get this or understand it or adopt it? I think that changing frames is why I do the work. Introducing ideas and helping to change and drive the conversation is why I show up. I mean, it's also why I like to play chess, right? Like, I'm trying to think about, 50 moves ahead around the conversation we want to drive. So I think about, for example, the mention of the word sexualized media and how I know people like Gloria were using that terminology before the media wanted to talk about sexualized media as it related to women in conflict zones who were sexually assaulted. And there were people who thought, oh, that word is too big for Americans to understand, which is coded. That the so-called working class that only seems to consist of white people who are male and that and that sort of framework won't get it. And I think that it's actually very condescending and problematic, but I think it's really about a really deep inability to want to release the connection to that power and the centrality of a certain way of thinking.
Yeah.
I think I could say that for myself in certain places where I'm privileged and say, oh, this is how I understand things, and I'm not comfortable with wanting to change my framework, but that's what it's all about. The cycles of academia, for example, we're thinking about how there are frameworks that are being created right now that 30 years from now will be in mainstream conversations within academia as accepted notions that are probably being challenged in people's dissertations as we speak. And I think that is why it is on us to continue to push back, and which is one of the reasons why I had said to some of those trainers who had said to me, oh, it's irresponsible to be telling Black women that they can use intersectionality in mainstream outlets, to say, actually, this is one where we're not going to compromise. As long as we name it and explain what it is so that people understand that it is something that is related to systems, that it's something related to individual experiences that are making us all less free, that's something everyone can get. My grandmother on my dad's side did not go to college, and I think maybe she had an 8th grade education, but she's someone who gets intersectionality because she lived it as a domestic worker.
That's right.
And so I also think that it's a failure of our craft for us to not believe in the inherent intelligence of the people who we are writing for and connecting with.
Yeah, Rebecca?
I so agree with you that there is an anxiety, there's a fear. Some of the people who want us to not use this language are very nervous that the meaning behind the language is powerful, which of course it is, right? It's powerful in changing how we understand the world, people's relationships with each other, power, identity. And so for years, as a journalist at mainstream places, I have had arguments with editors who have said, don't gunk up your copy with jargon, right? I don't want to read cisgender in there. I don't want to read intersectionality. That is academic jargon. It belongs elsewhere. And by the way, I should say that at various points, I have sometimes been sympathetic to this argument, right? That writing for a mainstream audience, the more important thing for me is not necessarily to use the word, it's to get the ideas and the meaning of what the word is across. And in fact, if the word's going to be alienating, then I don't want to put off my readers by using it. I would rather have them keep on reading to get the meaning, right? So this is a discussion that I've been having at this point now for a decade. But one of the most interesting things that's happened in the post-election period is I have seen, and intersectionality has been the word that people freak out about, right? And it's interesting because the concept is so clear once you think about it, and but it's really like editors at mainstream places are like, don't use the word intersectional, it's very scary. Okay, so about 2 months ago, I was writing a profile of a senator, of Kirsten Gillibrand, and I'm sitting in, and for anybody who's interviewed or heard or talked to a politician, you know that like it's simple, digestible sound bites at all, like everybody's trained. Right. And I'm sitting in her office, and she starts talking about intersectionality, and she starts talking, and she starts talking about intersectional analysis, and how she's reading about it, and how she's beginning to understand the history of protest movements in a new way. And I am sitting there thinking, I have just won every fight with every editor who's ever told me that this is an inaccessible concept and a clunky word that's never gonna be useful in my prose. Because people are, and I do actually, this is one of the things that makes me optimistic. I think people are hungrier perhaps than they've been, at least readers, if not the people at the top of the media, to have a more nuanced conversation and to learn more about what things they don't know enough about.
You know, and it's funny because I'm listening to y'all and I'm thinking, I wonder how much when we train students in journalism and media, we talk to them about the politics of fighting editors. Because I write for a couple of publications myself, and it is a fight. Last week I wrote about Bill O'Reilly, and I was saying, oh, racism and sexism work in tandem. And, you know, my editor just kept saying, tell me how. Tell me more. And I was like, in 1,200 words? Like, you know, like how, you know, so part of it is about both advocating for the perspective that you want to tell, and recognizing that it's not just a fight to get your readers to hear you, but sometimes it's a fight to get the folks who have the ability to publish you to hear you too, right? And so, that's just an additional comment, moderator's privilege. But it's a thing that we have to do as we train students, is to teach them how to advocate for their ideas as well.
But the fact that you're training students to do that, I mean, I just have to say, I think that is so important, because I have now, I think in my 30s coming in, my mom had been like, oh, congratulations, it is going to be so awesome, because you're going to really stop caring so much about what people think about you, and then it just gets better from then. But I was thinking about that when I was in school, and thinking about how no one ever told me to challenge any editor. I was very much told that if I didn't get my act together and straighten my hair, that it wouldn't matter that I had talent, that I wouldn't be able to have a career in broadcast journalism, which was my major. Wow. That's what I was being told by my professors. And so I think that even in terms of teaching agency and also advocating for what you know to be true and can support with evidence and facts and conviction, I think is extremely important, because it took me so much time after that, when I could have been producing really good work and examining lots of issues that I cared about, trying to figure out if I actually had a place in this field, because I was told that I didn't look the part.
Right. Wow. I mean, and so that's another way that intersectionality shows up to shape even who gets access to fields. But one of the things that y'all are also saying in this conversation is the real power of feminist media work in the last decade or so to reshape the conversation. So I'm thinking, Rebecca, about you saying, okay, so Kirsten Gillibrand is now talking about intersectionality. She didn't get that from the New York Times.
No.
She got it from reading some kind of small progressive Vox or The Atlantic or Slate, right, or The Root, right? She got it from reading some of these smaller kind of, journalistic outlets. But I'm also thinking in this moment about your bust piece on Solange, which I loved, where she talked about where she gets her feminism from, right? And that she gets it from small blogs and organizations. And so does that feel like, so even in this moment where we're fighting every step of the way, do you feel like feminist political media has in fact reshaped how we talk about and think about feminism?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So Solange Knowles, who is an amazing, radiant person, was talking with me about how Crunk Feminist Collective and other publications teach her about theory, that she didn't go to college, and she said, I didn't go to college, I went on this other path, but I learned so much from people like you. She said that to me, from people like you. She mentioned Salamisha Tillett, who's an amazing scholar. She mentioned Black Women's Blueprint and other organizations and online feminists who are shaping the conversation that's ending up in her songs and work that she's building. And so I also heard something similar from Tavi Jevinson, who started Rookie Magazine, who said that right now she's still building her media company and has not gone to college yet, but that she's reading theory. She's on Tumblr learning about theory and other things from other people who are taking these classes. So I think that we are also playing a role in terms of helping to crowdsource theoretical interventions and scholarship and fact-checking. One of the things that Tavi and I were talking about the other day was about this idea that she said we have to become our own filters in the era of fake news and so-called alternative facts. And I was thinking, oh, that's what they taught me to do in grad school, is to become my own filter. So I remember being in this PhD class when I was in a master's program and having some PhD students trying to intimidate me and others because they were seeing us as threats to their funding. When we were in this class, I'm just keeping it real.
Tell it then. Okay.
You know,
Wow.
like somebody saw me with one of those comic books that was helping me understand some Chris Deva, and they were like, "Oh, you need to use that in order to understand the postmodernist theory." And I said, "Oh, yes, I do actually." And when I was there, we were having a conversation, and I was talking about how if we were going to be talking about these complex issues of race and class in a critical race theory course, that I felt that we needed to have more accessible symposia and conversations because I didn't think people like my grandmother were being included, and they were the people these policies were in fact affecting. And I was told that it was very elitist of me to expect that any conversation that would happen within the ivory tower should be happening in other places, that it was our job to be working on scholarship in our space, and we shouldn't be trying to inflict it on others. So when I think about inflict was the word. I remembered that one deeply. When I think about that conversation and how it almost psyched me out from wanting to be in that PhD class, and yet I continued to show up and became like very annoying and well-studied in that class, I felt like it showed me why this sort of work is important, why making theory accessible, why having popularized discourse is key to actually changing things, because some people aren't invested in the project of transformation and using these theories for that. But we are, and so it actually woke me up to think about what is it that I can do to help translate these concepts for other people who might not have access to these spaces, and not in a hierarchical way, but in a way that this is my duty because other people paved the way for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, but you know, it makes me think though about, so Rebecca, you're working on work now around emotion, and so one of the assumptions, and I wonder what it means to be a journalist and a writer in this moment, the assumption is that if you get the argument right, and you get the storytelling right, that you can make people change their minds. But the thing that we're seeing in this moment of, what do they call it, sort of like confirmation bias, right, that people double down on their thought processes, that the profusion of facts does not in fact compel people to change their minds. And so what role does emotion play in this moment where we think that the challenge to fake news is more facts, but it seems like if we don't actually tap into people's feelings about it, their fear, their anger, whatever, that we can in fact get them to change their minds.
Well, I think there are two processes in place when it comes to the expression of and communication of argument, right? That may be amplified by emotion,
Sure.
right? One is the project of persuasion, right? And that's hard, convincing somebody to change their mind. The other is the process of gaining support from others who might agree already, but not have thought of it that way, who might not have an opinion, of gathering support
Sure.
on your side
Sure.
to make your point louder and to help bring others who are prone to be sympathetic into the conversation who might not otherwise be participants, right? And I think that those are two, and those things happen if you're making an argument in your journalism or online. There are two different directions in which you're going if you're trying to gain support for that argument. One is toward your opposition, and you have a generally smaller chance of getting them to reverse their position, but you might, right? Like, you know, that's part of the idea. But the other is out. to people who might not have heard it put this way before, and who, when they do, say, wait a minute, that's compelling to me, and then come and join you on your side of the argument.
Yeah.
And that's something I saw happen last week in terms of the media, and that I think is a reflection of I think in part, of a feminist media's increased power. This conversation last week about the DNC, Tom Perez and Bernie Sanders, around so they went out to campaign for the mayoral candidate in Omaha, Heath Mello, who is a Democrat who is anti-choice, right? Nothing new under the sun, right? The Democratic Party for many years has been full of anti-choice politicians, and we have been told many times that it is strategically important to get more of them so that we can win in red states. This is in the face of ever more polling that, in fact, it's not necessary, that support for Roe is 7 and 10. There's almost no more popular frame of support within Democratic politics, whatever. This has happened again and again, and it most notably and most powerfully happened after the 2004 election, after John Kerry's loss. Every time Democrats lose an election, somebody high up in the Democratic Party says, I have a great idea for how we can get more powerful. We can ditch reproductive rights and make the party bigger. This happened after 2004. You saw everybody from John Kerry to Howard Dean to Hillary Clinton sort of running away from strong positions on reproductive rights. And then Rahm Emanuel decided we could win the House if we just got a lot of anti-choice Democrats to come in and win the House, which we did. And then we got a Stupak-Pitts amendment in the middle of health care reform, where it was like, oh yeah, we're going to reform health care, except we're not going to pay for abortion. And so women got thrown under the bus. This has happened. This is the history of the Democratic Party. So there was tremendous fear. My fear instantly, like at 8:45 on November 8th, was, oh, I see the immediate next thing that's going to happen. I mean, I said that literally, I think, at 8:45 at the Javits Center. So when this thing happened last week, almost immediately, and both Tom Perez and Bernie Sanders then doubled down on their argument and said, oh, no, this is a great new strategy we've thought of. We've had the greatest idea about how to get more progressive. But the difference was, and this was, I mean, it was swift and it was wide-reaching. Social media exploded, right? So I saw Amani Gandhi at Rewire, 2 seconds. Amani, she's like, what are you talking about? That's how I first saw that anything was even happening. Soon it has spread. It's Twitter, it's Facebook. Soon people are writing columns. I wrote a column about it. Rewire did incredible work on it. This week, it's in the New York Times, explaining not just the history of how Democrats always do this, but also how reproductive rights are not separate from economic issues, which has been an error that gets repeated over and over and over again. And those of us who think about these things correct it amongst ourselves. But now it's like, no. This is going to be in the New York Times. You cannot talk about progressive economic policy and not include reproductive rights, and we are going to lay this out for you. And that happened because of a quick-acting and powerful feminist media that ranged from social media participants to blogs and sort of small outlets, and that worked its way up to mainstream outlets and to the New York Times opinion page. Yeah. And we just saw that happen in 7 days. Wow. And Perez wholly reversed his. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be a battle we fight every day.
Sure.
Forever. But the fact that it had an impact, I mean, I think we just saw that in action in a way, the way that it's the increasing power of a feminist media.
Yeah. Look, that's feminism, on fleek, right? I mean, it's the best of this. But one of the things I'm thinking about is this tension that some of the argument in this moment around feminist political media is that it's too bogged down in identity politics, right? This is Sanders' kind of claim, right, as he goes back to do the identity politics of caping for white working class men and their anger. That's identity politics too, right? But the sort of argument of feminist political media is that no one will take us seriously because identity politics. So I wonder about that in two veins. One, what you seem to suggest, Rebecca, is that when we come together around issues, we're really quite powerful. And so saying we're not giving up our reproductive rights, so you get a black woman, Imani Gandhi, right, really sort of pushing this out into the ether and then everyone getting on board. So that seems to be the best of both worlds, that you have feminist solidarities around issues. But there are also real beefs and dramas with the way that black women do all of this labor online, but also sort of get a reputation for being angry and going at white ladies a lot. And I wonder about that. I wonder, is this the problem? Like, is this a problem, like identity politics? And what is your sense of how we navigate it? Because sometimes I worry too about the level of beefing that happens between feminists online, right? I know there's a thing I'm supposed to say about how it's good for feminism. I don't always know that it is, though. And so I wonder what y'all feel about it.
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking about a lot as we talk about resistance is strategy, and how one of my great teachers was talking about how not all strategy needs to happen in public.
Sure.
So one of the things I've been thinking about has been, where is the space for radical transparency to happen so we can all learn and grow and be accountable? And how do we also hold space for not putting all our strategy out in public for our opponents to outthink our chess move and steal our queen? So I think about this a lot when I have beefs that I'm tempted to jump into and to think about the ways in which I've wished that I had been treated when people took issue with things that I had written or had questions about it, or might have even misunderstood where I was coming from, or could have called me in a place where I could have then come back and said, I apologize, here's what I've learned. And I think that is why we actually need to have more spaces for us to have conversation. I think sometimes if there were more resources for us to actually be able to get to know each other in ways that are less disposable. I mean, I think that's also a part of our larger culture of teaching us this concept that people are disposable and that sort of thing. I think that it would change. There are people I've had open beef with.
Yeah.
Who
Me too.
I've been in communion with in other spaces. And some people we've had beef with together.
That's right.
And but there have been places where we have come together in open space and seen each other in our full humanity, and also in specific spaces like, the shared experience of gender or a shared experience of blackness or being a woman of color, that's allowed us to say, okay, this is where I was coming from and why I showed up the way that I did, and next time I'd like for us to have the conversation. Here's my phone number. So it's in a very basic way. I think it's important for us to also think about the morals and ethics with which we would like to engage each other.
Yes.
I've been thinking a lot about social ethics. I've been thinking if I could have 9 lives, another thing I would want to do is go to like Union Theological Seminary and study social ethics. Because when I think about how I would like to do the work better, it would be to really embody and show up with the kinds of social ethics that I think we need to transform our world and to do work in a less transactional way.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I'd like to see more of is more humility, more compassion, and more effort toward taking the time to really listen to each other and be thoughtful about how we're engaging.
Yeah. One of the things that you're really saying, and this is the thing that strikes me because some of the work I do here is as a feminist theorist, is that the media is reshaping what feminism is, how we understand it, and the ethics of engagement. Now that I can just, if I'm mad with you, I can just rip you apart on Twitter, right? That has reshaped what feminism needs to say.
And get all your friends to rip me apart, too.
I mean, listen. Not if they know what's good. Okay. But yes, so I wonder about that. But I wonder about how y'all think that feminist media has reshaped feminism itself as a politic.
Well, I agree with you, Brittney, that it's exposing resentments and competing points of view that have always been there. I mean, one of the defining features of the women's movement, right, which we're only now beginning to talk about, and I think in part it's because all this stuff is out there in the open, right? I agree that finding spaces where we could do this without making it all public would be strategically useful by many means, but I also think there's something healthy about better out than in, to some degree, right? And that one of the things about feminism that is and the women's movement loosely defined, is it's a majority movement. And that the way that minority rule maintains its power is to divide the majority against each other by affording different groups within that majority different kinds of advantages and privileges. And of course, race is one of the chief dividing lines there in terms of the many power advantages and privileges afforded white women. And a lot of the exposed beefing, right, that's happening now, all that beef has been there for centuries, right? And it has been exposed in other periods too, right? But with a different kind of amplification level because it's not on Twitter, you know? And I think that the thing we have to do, there are all kinds of personal choices we have to make about like I've learned a lot from people who have come at me on social media in certain instances. And in other instances, I have learned nothing except that I don't think that they're, that they're right. But so we all make our personal choices about how we engage. Do we respond with what tone? Are we aggressive? We all make the choices that are comfortable for us in terms of how we communicate and how we protect ourselves and all that. But I think that the bigger thing is that when we have these arguments, we also take an analytic approach to why. Why are we having these arguments? And whatever your personal animus is, what does it tell us about the way that we have been divided, right? And that where those divisions are and what they tell us about power differentials and what can we learn from it and where are the places where we can come together. And we just had, I think the Women's March was an incredibly powerful model because the organizers themselves of the Women's March were women who were very sharply divided politically over politics, primary politics. Some were super Bernie people, some were super Hillary people, and those fights had been as bitter, right, as just about anything. And they organized this event that was the biggest one-day public protest in America's history by finding the places where they could come together. And that doesn't mean burying the beef, right? They still argue, right? But it does mean saying, okay, let's try to understand that we can both disagree sharply and agree powerfully, simultaneous.
I think it's what Gloria was saying about the means being the ends.
Right.
I mean, I think that's generally, that's the connection I find between what we were both saying, that I think that there needs to be more thoughtfulness about that, without negating those very sharp points where we need to agree that we disagree and that there's friction that needs to be addressed. But yeah, I think of that a lot with the Women's March because I think of microaggressions that I experienced at the Women's March specifically from white women that day. And I had a woman literally come up to me. She was coming off of a sidewalk to go on the other thing and didn't even know me, didn't talk to me, took my shoulders and pressed up on the sidewalk for me and then just kept walking. Older white woman. And my husband saw it and was just like, did that just happen? She just used me as a prop and pushed me like I was just an object. And I thought, okay, see, here was the reminder for me to keep doing the work, that we're here right now, but that this work still needs to happen. But it also kind of showed me that it also didn't negate the power of the day. That it didn't negate, there were some people who were saying, well, that happened, so you can see why you shouldn't have even shown up for that march, and that it was only for white women. And I had people who said that to me when I shared it, and I thought, no, I'm not gonna let her actually define my experience of the march, and the reason I showed up was because I want myself and people like me to be counted. So I do think that we need to have more conversation about the means as well.
Yeah, I mean, it also just points out, though, that the way in which it still requires Black women in particular to be magnanimous all the time. Because she should have, I mean,
I had some thoughts.
Because I was like, what now? Okay,
Yes.
see, right. So one of the things I want to do as part of this conversation is we can't talk about the power of feminist political media without talking about the sort of do-it-yourself ethos that social media has made a new version of, but that has been a part of feminist praxis since the very beginning. And so one of the cool things that we've been doing here at Rutgers this semester, we have a gender and media minor, and the capstone for that minor requires students to produce a significant piece of feminist digital media. So I'm the professor for our gender and media capstone, and our students have been producing episodes of a podcast that they write, record, and edit called Uncaged, Words Without Bars. And so I want to play a clip. I want to play one now, and I'll play one near the end, of some of the work that they've been doing trying to understand feminist issues in the media as a way to help us think about the kinds of things that digital media affords us the ability to do with a few free tools and the sorts of possibilities that might emerge in this moment. So this is part of a compilation that they put together, but let me play, I'm gonna play just a clip, hold on. So I wanna play you just the intro so that you can hear this, and then I will play, I wanna play one segment for you.
everyone, this is George, and you're watching Uncaged, Words Without Bars. So this is a bit of a special...
Okay, so I wanted you to just hear their intro music. They picked that, they edited it, and they do the voiceovers. And they've taught themselves how to do it. Okay.
Hello, welcome to Responded. My name is Lily, and this week we're going to be locking up Alex Jones. Jones is best known for his conspiracy theories as the host of the Alex Jones Show on his website Infowars, which has been classified by nearly every major news outlet as being fake news. The streak of fake news has been popularized in the past couple months, and it's also being credited with helping the election of President Trump. There have also been rumors that the White House would issue Infowars a press pass, basically legitimizing fake news in the mainstream media and taking this once fringe strain of news and bringing it into the mainstream. So before we get any further, let's take a listen to a clip from Jones's show.
What do I do, Lord? Destroy the child. Corrupt them all. This is their plan, people. These are demons. Just like the Bible says, it's basically an intergalactic invasion into this space through people. I'm telling you, it's what all the ancients said, it's what they warned of, it's what we're dealing with. They're demons. They're frickin' interdimensional invaders, okay? I'll just say it, make fun of me all you want on CNN or wherever, but everyone already innately knows this. These people are not frickin' humans, okay? Hillary Clinton is a goddamn demon.
Okay, and so throughout the campaign trail, Trump appeared on Jones's show. This shows a new direction of media, and the news is going with a president who refuses to acknowledge facts. This week, Jones is in the news for propagating the Pizzagate hoax that became prominent on online conspiracy theory forums, which caused a man to drive down to D.C., come into a pizza shop with a rifle and demand answers of a child pornography ring ran by the restaurant's owner, Hillary Clinton, and her campaign chairman, John Podesta. Alex Jones has also perpetuated a bunch of other conspiracy theories, also claiming that the Sandy Hook tragedy was made by government actors. Lastly, just to get a sense of who this person is and what his relationship is with President Trump, here are some headlines from his website. Is Michelle Obama transgender? Global warming is a crock of shit. Obama caught running ISIS. Why are feminists fat and ugly? So for all these reasons, we're locking up Alex Jones and the fake news media.
Yes, so I wanted you to hear a little bit of our students' work. Some of y'all are in the room. Stand up and let the folks see you. So even though these are really scary times, I wonder, do you feel inspired by our ability to create new kinds of media, or are you more cautious? Do you think we should be cautious, or should we just be out here trying everything to see what sticks? What do you think?
I mean, both. This is the, as the development of all of these new kinds of media, as I've kind of lived and worked through, writing online and having a comment section. And this was wonderful because I have to imagine that when Gloria was writing for print, you might get letters, right, in the mail, or hear from people on the street in New York City, right? But when I was writing for Solange, when basically before an age of more social media, where what you had was the comments section, a piece would go up, and 2 minutes later, I'd be hearing from a reader, and in many cases, those readers from anywhere around the world, and in many cases, I learned a lot. I mean, talk about early beef from some really smart commenters who taught me, because I was learning about the history of social movements and about race and class and the history of the women's movement, and I was learning a lot from my readers who knew a lot. And that was this wonderful thing in the comments section. Now, about 5 minutes later, I'd get a comment that told me that I just needed to be fucked, and that I would be a lot less angry and bitter if I were prettier and had a boyfriend, And so what do you say about that? It is simultaneously an expansion of a conversation that is really useful and important and from which everybody can learn. And also a new avenue for abuse and, and ways for people to try to shut down and diminish the conversation and the people who are having it. And then you can take that dynamic in which both things are simultaneously true, and that's been true throughout the explosion of social media, of our ability to communicate online and expand the geographic and possibilities and democratize the conversation to a degree. So as far as trying out new media, I think we're greeted with the same things. I mean, we're experimenting, we're trying new things. They're going to open new doors for how we learn and learn from each other and our opportunities to listen to each other and to be in conversation. At the same time, that's also going to mean new risks. Part of what happens is when you take the media from being an elite and closed community in which there are gatekeepers and in which only the most already privileged and advantaged people can have their voice and expand it, that's terrific. But it also means that you've got media coming from all kinds of places that you don't know
Right.
how good it's going to be. So there. I mean, the answer is not one or the other. It's both, and many other things.
I mean, the thing that I've been thinking as I've been listening to both of you is that what you've convinced me of today that I wasn't necessarily thinking before is that feminist political media in many ways has been the savior of the American public sphere because it has continued to make public conversations robust and political and to democratize who gets access and to argue that when certain voices would be suppressed that in fact they matter. But the challenge is, of course, that you all are pointing to is that robust publics also encode an inherent danger, right? That we can do particular kinds of violence. And so this is the thing that I wonder about and why I'm asking these questions about emotion, because now Solange's comment section is closed. Like, I looked the other day because I didn't realize that you wrote for Solange, and when I found it out, I was like, we're sisters. But Solange, because it was one of the places that helped to amplify voices, so part of what I'm thinking about is that it seems to me that feminist political media has also been a bellwether of this moment, that the sort of harassment that journalists writing in a feminist mode have experienced many years before we came up to this particular political moment had something to tell us about how we got here and that maybe we didn't listen. Because now most sites are just closing their comment sections because they're so terrible that the kind of productive things that used to happen in them cannot happen anymore. Even on a place like PBS or NPR, like PBS, their comment section is terrible. And you would think, well, the people who listen to public anything or watch public anything hopefully would be a bit more broad-minded, and you don't see that. So I wonder if that is if it is the case that what happened in this, to shape this political moment is that feminists were taking the hits around harassment, violence, and threats of assault, and we didn't realize that could become really mainstream, that it wasn't just for people, because we were told that it was because we had fringe ideas, but it turns out that it wasn't that.
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, because I think that the reason I fight for open participation in media and to help as many people as I can to help amplify their voices is because the reason we are experiencing so much harassment and abuse is precisely to silence us. They are weaponizing hate in comment spaces by doing dogpiling, as they call it, on Twitter and other social media tools in order to scare us into silence, because studies have shown that women are disproportionately targeted, young women specifically, by the most egregious forms of online abuse, doxing, stalking, etc. Cyber exploitation, revenge porn would be the more crude way to talk about it. And so I think that a big part of what we also need to talk about is why online harassment is a free expression issue. That there are a lot of people who would be participating in the conversation if the very real threats did not exist that are preventing them from speaking up. There's not enough research on how women of color and Islamic women and trans people are also disproportionately affected even more around. If you're a woman who's also from another one of these groups, you're experiencing even heightened levels of threats and violence. And that is because the people who wish to silence us understand that media is our strongest public education tool, and they understand that when we're speaking out that we're able to influence hearts and minds. And so I think that that's why I try to take my inspiration from Ida B. Wells and to bringing the truth to the light. But I do also recognize that everyone is not in a position or has the privilege to do that safely.
Yeah. Rebecca.
I also just want to say that what happens online in terms of the increased rates of abuse and harassment of women is a reflection of what happens at every level of society. I mean, this is why the idea that, right, there aren't protections in place for women online, there aren't solid protections in place for women in workplaces. That's why sexual harassment is an issue that affects women as a class. Look at tipped workers. I mean, one of the big concerns about this administration is without labor unions, you rely on agencies to do the work of protecting, and standing up for women's rights not to be sexually harassed within the workplace. And that's especially, of course, true in tipped industries, disproportionately likely to be women and women of color. But there aren't protections in place for that. And how can we even be surprised by that when, Bill O'Reilly and Roger Ailes have run a news network that contributed to the rise of Republican power over the past 2 decades, and openly, I mean, this was not a secret. There were reports of sexual harassment for years and years in books and in magazines reported. But Clarence Thomas sits on the Supreme Court and makes decisions about the Voting Rights Act, gutting the Voting Rights Act, when everybody knew, everybody heard how Clarence Thomas behaved. Our sitting president has himself bragged about sexual predation and has been accused of 12 or more at this point, women, of assault. He is our president. So that it happens online and in social media, and we still sort of, even when we, when Ailes and O'Reilly are fired, it's like, yay, no, they had power, nation-shaping power over a period of decades, and we don't, and there is a significant portion of the population that hears Donald Trump talking about grabbing pussies and says, this is how men talk, this is the norm, this kind of power abuse is the way the world works. And so it's not, that women, and especially women online who are talking about shaking up that power structure, receive a disproportionate amount of abuse. I don't expect it to be treated with seriousness because it is not treated with seriousness in the White House.
And I just want to say one thing in answer to that. I just had a chill in my soul because there was so much work that we were doing as a coalition to work to push tech companies to do better around online harassment for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. And then last year, President Barack Obama, said at South by Southwest that because of the work that activists like us were doing, that the White House was recognizing that online harassment was sexual harassment and that it was a public space issue, just like any other form of violence. And so when you were talking about the reality of the White House now and who is sitting in it and how that conversation has been set back in less than 365 days, it was just very chilling.
And I said something like this last night, too, so I apologize for repeating myself, but it's no accident that that's what President Barack Obama was talking about a year ago, and that our current president is Donald Trump. This is Trump was summoned. He is an embodiment of the anxieties and resentments of the kinds of people who have traditionally had that power and had that power go unchallenged toward the people who've been challenging it from all different kinds of angles. It is because Barack Obama was the president, because he was taking harassment seriously, because he was talking about paid leave, because all of these kinds of things, because Hillary Clinton was running for president, that we have Donald Trump. He is an answer. He is a response. He is the harasser of the feminist media online.
And he's an online harassing troll. I mean, that's like the other piece too. Yes.
I mean, that is the thing, right? This is also what I mean when I say that feminist political media was the bellwether, because we have a president that comes to power largely by showing out online and mistreating people online and putting out stories in the media that are fake news. I mean, he uses the playbook of this current moment to come to power, which is how we see it, which is why the kind of work that you all are doing and that we are trying to do is so important. I wonder, so I also think it's important to say, you can respond if you have a response, that Black women really matter here. In a really significant way. They don't just matter, they matter because they were the ones who said, this is about to be a shit show. Let's elect Hillary. However we feel, let's put our feelings to the side because we cannot have this. But it's also Black women online who are often raising the flag and saying, this is a problem, pay attention, what do we do? And so I wonder if, and this is getting towards the question that I want to ask to end so that we can open up for discussion. We wanted lots of time for discussion. What is feminist political media's responsibility to Black women and to women of color? It is deeply beholden to the labor of Black women. And the reason that I'm asking that is because I wonder about what feminist political media can do to reshape the future, not just in terms of American politics, but in terms of feminist issues. And it seems like we're in a critical moment where if we don't figure out this solidarity thing for real, then we're going to have a real problem. We need a feminist movement, but the fact that things can go awry so quickly online scares me, because we can splinter really easily. And we don't actually have a good historical precedent for women managing to come together for a long time across race in order to get things done. And so I wonder, Rebecca, as a white woman writing, so I'm going to say something slightly inappropriate, but I hope you will appreciate it. So when you write, I often share with my friends, hashtag Becky with the good analysis. So, yeah, so you're a writer who feels, it's a Beyonce reference for those of you who don't know. But if you feel to me like a person who gets it, and not in a hey, look at me, I'm a white girl who gets it, but as someone who really takes Black women seriously. So I wonder how you negotiate that, because it feels to me like you figured out the way to do it. And then I wonder, Jamia, how you negotiate it as someone who is a Black woman, but with a sort of really expansive approach. Yeah.
I'm not sure I've figured out the way to do it.
Okay.
I work on figuring out the approach all the time, and I've been thinking a lot about white women, and what is unique about my responsibility in communicating with white women, which is that's something I haven't thought about this way until post-election, right? And so the 53% of white women, and we know this is not new, white women have voted for Republicans, 56% of them voted for Mitt Romney, but I'd never, I'm gonna get to answering your question more directly, but the week before the election, I was in a discussion with a group of women about the election, and Michaela Angela Davis, who's a really brilliant activist, was talking about white men. And she said, she was talking about white men on the left, many of whom had supported Bernie Sanders in the primary. And she was talking about, why aren't you out there talking to the white men right now? This is, 7 days before the election. So why aren't you out there right now talking to your demographic? Why aren't you out there, and the phrase she used was, go get your boys, right? Okay, probably not a day has passed since November 8th that I have not thought in my head, I am supposed to go get my girls, right? That I have, and that it is not the job of women of color who have been doing this forever to go deal with the white women. It is my responsibility, and many other people's responsibility, but that I need to find a way to write persuasively to white women. And that part of my job, if I'm going to do that, is to help recognize that Black women have been there before me and before them. So that if I'm going to try to write persuasively about an issue, if I'm going to write a column about opposition to Hyde, if I'm going to write about how abortion and access to abortion is key to economic inequality and to racial inequality, and I'm going to write about Hyde, and I want to write about it in terms of contemporary electoral politics. It can't just be about, oh, Hillary Clinton opposed Hyde in her presidential campaign. It has to be that Barbara Lee wrote the Each Woman Act, which was in opposition to Hyde 2 years ago, and that the reproductive justice movement has been talking about this stuff for decades. You can't just start with the white voice that has become the most prominent in part because it's white. That if you should include that voice, right? But that you have to go back and make sure that the women of color who have been doing the work before, that their work is acknowledged always in your argument. And by the way, I'm not saying that I always do that well. But that's part of what I keep thinking, because there is an opportunity here, right? And there's also the opportunity for a lot of resentment. I think white women right now are awake and angry in a way that they haven't been before. And I understand some of the frustration. I mean, that sign from the Women's March, like, I hope all you nice white ladies, I'll see you at the next Black Lives Matter march, right? That's real. But at the same time, we need those white ladies to be angry. We desperately need them, because without them, we lose the elections. And so we need to find a way to reach them. But then the peril is that they're persuaded, they're angry, they're engaged, they're active, and they take over the whole conversation and behave as though they invented anger. Okay? And that, right? So we know that's the line we're walking, and that's the division that there are already, resentments and divisions and everything, and by the way, I think they're inescapable. They're a sign of actual health and activity within the women's movement, because, any movement that represents the majority is, by its nature, going to be a sort of cacophonous group of competing priorities and identities and perspectives. But I think that we want to wake the white women without then having the white women come in and take over everything. And so for those of us who think a lot about communicating with white women, it is really important to remind them at every possible opportunity of the history that has preceded them and the ways in which the way they're feeling, and in a way that's not punishing. Right? Because you don't want to say you're not allowed to feel that because somebody felt it before you. But sort of saying, look, you have company from the past, right? This way you're feeling, other people have felt it and been angry and have done some thinking already about how we might proceed that you might enjoy and that might help deepen your analysis of what's going on. So it's that tricky project that's obviously a very bad answer, because it's not at all neat. It's just the stuff I'm mucking through in my head as I think about my responsibilities and the readers I'm trying to communicate with, and how it's most responsible and honest to communicate with them.
So I was thinking about, it seems like it was light years away, but it was on Sunday. I was on CNN, and I was on the Reliable Sources show talking with Brian Stelter about Bill O'Reilly's ouster, and trying not to smile too much because I was excited about that. But in that conversation, the way he framed one of his questions to me was, so what do you think about this new tactic of grassroots groups like Color of Change and other coalitions coming together to push the advertisers to push Fox to get Bill O'Reilly out? And so I said, oh, our ancestors taught us how to do this. This is nothing new. Economic coercion. And again, I was thinking about Ida B. Wells, who said that hearts and minds and changing the consciousness of white men was never the most effective way, but it was always going for their pocketbook. And I mentioned that, and I could see like a quizzical look from him at that moment, but I precisely did because I wanted to say, no, this is not new. Because of some of the people who are now involved in the taking of credit or the conversation about how this happened, that it appears new to people who may not recognize the full humanity or organizing power and labor of the people who did that. It feels new, but it's not new. And we have been given this playbook before, we've seen this before, and it's not a new fight. And we will continue to practice economic solidarity and economic action. And so my answer to your question is really about that I think we have to continue to practice solidarity in more radical ways. We are in an inflection point right now. this is a very severe backlash that is a very important time that we need to handle very delicately, because it could have very serious implications for us if we don't. But I also feel like, for me, I do not feel called to pander to the public that Bernie Sanders, for example, is inviting me to pander to.
Preach.
I have had people, I remember right after the election being in a space where I'm one of the only people of color there and the youngest person in a governing body that I participate in. And they were kind of all talking about how we need to be more compassionate in terms of connecting to understanding the stories of these people who are obviously very resentful and angry. And I was born in South Carolina. I understand their anger and resentment. And it's actually not that deep, does not need deep analysis, and it's not just about economic anxiety.
Right.
And it's about racial animus and misogyny. And so for me, I remember having someone later say, oh, it seems like you're really angry and like we need to have a conversation about it, after I said, well, I actually don't feel like it's my job to pander to these people, to tap dance, to do anything. I'm going to practice radical solidarity to be a more liberated gatekeeper, to amplify the voices of the most marginalized people right now, use the contacts, access, and network that I have to make sure that there are more people speaking out, recognize that I am one Black woman's voice and one Black woman's experience. There are many more that are not me, so to also create space for that, and to let you and invite you to get your cousins, your sisters, and your brothers. And it's been interesting that I've also been practicing letting go of feeling like I have to carry the work, because Black women are also conditioned, like women are, but Black women have a special conditioning that we are, to feel like we have to carry everybody else's work, that has been a part of the institutional racism and also the internalized oppression that I have carried. And so even, from my husband, who is a white guy from New Hampshire, I've said, oh, yo, you go get your Trump-supporting cousins. Like, not my job. When he's asked me, oh, do you have talking points for which I can engage them? No. I have to protect myself and my psychic bubble right now, and so that I can be fortified to help my people in this political moment, so that I can help strengthen the people who are going to help get me free. And I can't rely on them to do that. I know there are other approaches to that, but that's really where I'm at right now. And I think that it feels to me like it's an integrity. That I do believe there are ways that we can change hearts and minds, and there are people who can move, who are people of good heart and good conscience. And those millions of people who showed up and did not choose the person who is now sitting in the Oval showed us that. But I also know that it is not my job to be wasting very limited, precious life force trying to convince those people of my full humanity. And so that's why I also wrote an essay for an upcoming anthology that's women's responses to the election, about how what I gave up on November 9th was my own need to prove myself toward liberation. I decided that the myth of meritocracy was something that, even though I'd taken all sorts of social theory classes and would see myself as a social democrat, actually realized, oh, I'm actually buying into this idea that I have to be hypervigilantly perfect in order to be free. And I'm letting go of that. And I'm going to help other people let go of that too. And that is my project. And so that's really what I'm doing.
Wow. Thank you. So thank y'all. Let's have a few questions, comments. Try to keep them brief, but let's hear from you.
I want to.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I want to thank the panelists for your insightful discussion, primarily on women of color, because it's always the elephant in the room, and no one ever wants to talk about how we are often put in the background of an issue that is really in the forefront. So thank you to both of you. My question is, many of us are responding in this sense of solidarity and oneness because of the election results. Do you believe that we would be in this place if Hillary Clinton had won the election?
That's what y'all here for.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that I've written specifically about Hillary for a really long time, and I did not think she was going to win the election. until the very end, at which point I thought there was a possibility that she might win the election. And at that point, and actually before then too, I started working on a book that I thought, with the idea that she might win, that was called The Season of the Witch. And I was going to try to write backlash in real time. Because what I felt it already, was the campaign and was the real swift freezing creep of anti-feminist and racist backlash. It was, obviously built throughout the Obama administration, and then it came on strong when there was the possibility that Obama was going to get a successor who was also not a white man. And I had discussions with my colleagues in the media, in the feminist media, about we're all losing our jobs, right? Like, no, last time this happened, there weren't the kind of structures in place. And I was like, no, something's coming. We don't know. We can't tell what shape it's going to take, but it's going to knock our knees out from under us. Even having said that, I lacked the imagination to actually imagine what that thing was that was going to knock our knees out from under us, which was the election itself. So, no, I think that there would not be this solidarity. Solidarity often is a lot easier to find in the face of a terrifying threat. And I wish, I said this last night, I'd rather have President Hillary Clinton and a Supreme Court and environmental protections in place and and a feminist media and a left media that is critical of President Hillary Clinton and everybody's angry. I'd rather have that than what we have now. It is true that given what we have now, I think it is incumbent on all of us to take advantage of the horrifying but necessary communication and solidarity and movement toward resistance that's happening. But yeah, I think it would have been awful in different ways. And certainly awful on the left, however loosely you want to define that. It would have been broken and angry and furious and in many ways destructive. And I think that women and people of color would have suffered, as always, in ways that would be different from what's happening now, but that would be very real. But I would have rather had that than this.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
I don't believe that we would have had this solidarity if Kasich or Rubio came in. It's the person that's in there now that caused this resurgence of his base. And Kasich wouldn't have created this base that our, who's in the Oval Office now, has created. It's just him himself that has created this animosity and his base.
It's really important.
And, whoever backed him, I really feel it's...
Yeah. So we're going to come to the front. Rachel, can you bring the mic up to the front?
Yep.
I actually think it's really important to say that the thing about somebody like Kasich is that he's just a reasonable racist, but he's still a racist. That part of what happens with Trump and the reason that you see so many Republican folks sort of march away from him is because initially they're all in line now. But initially it's because they wanted civilized racism. They wanted Reagan-type racism. They wanted it to be polished and subtle. But it's still racist. Kasich is no friend to Kasich is no friend to women. He's no friend to people of color. He's no friend to immigrants. He's no friend to any of these groups, and any more than Trump is, right? The only difference is that Trump is quite vocal. And so part of the thing that we're trying to get at on this panel and this discussion is what happens when all your stuff starts hanging out and showing. And now your slip is showing, your hemline is ragged, the threads are coming undone. And but we're acting like what you didn't have before was just a really nice tailor job, but it was raggedy on the inside the whole time, right? So I hear you, but the point is that Trump simply, in many ways, I think he shocked Republicans because he rode to power by doing what they'd subtly been doing forever, which is that they had been roping up. I mean, let's not forget that 2008 was the saga of the Tea Party. Yeah. Why are we acting like we hadn't seen Trump before? They told us 8 years ago, oh, we'll let you have your boy. He all right, but it's Obama. But as soon as he is done, we are coming for y'all, right? And so the Tea Party was the precursor to that.
And they told us then, too, that it was all about economic policy. If you remember the coverage of the Tea Party, it was like, no, this is all economic policy. And the only thing they tried to do was defund Planned Parenthood. And, I mean, that was all, what we're being told right now by reasonable news sources, that this is all about economics, and that that was also the message of the Tea Party.
That's right.
That's the tailored suit they try to wear.
That's right. You say that. Yeah. Yes.
I'm Gloria's friend from India, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. You know, we have a Trump-like situation in India. You must be knowing that. It's absolutely Trump-like. But there are two differences which I want to point out, though it may not be relevant because you're fighting your own fight. And by saying that your fight is not the same as ours, it doesn't make sense. But I do want to tell you that there's a very lively feminist media in India, also digital. And remember, digital has excluded the majority of Indian women. So while we talk to each other and we mobilize, tweeting and everything, say, yes, we'll all march on such and such a day, it just doesn't make a difference because majority are left out of digital. So we've adopted other methods like the one that Gloria referred to over the past in America, which was very, very effective politically. It's theater, it's music, it's stories, which many of the young feminists are doing in villages and cities, which is so moving, and in a way it is feminist media, but it is not the print media and it's not the digital media. So I was also puzzled why we have moved away from language like debate to language like conversation. You know, dialogue and not conversation. You know, conversation seems a mild and some sophisticated new, and it's coming across UN and donor agencies to India. Everybody who comes to India says, we'll have a conversation. And I said, we want to have a debate. Because there is a difference in the nuance of conflict resolution, which is what we are really up against. Not peaceful conversation, but conflict resolution. So it was fascinating, and I wanted to just point out that we have it too, but we are following different methods, and we just hope that the masses of women will rise. At the moment, it's very, very difficult, except for us, the elites, who march and sing and talk, but we are not able to get there. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I didn't get to share from the podcast in the later segments, so we have a whole segment of this podcast episode on transnational women's movements, and this podcast is about rape culture, and so there was a real sort of attempt to challenge, like, that, you know, rape culture is not just a Western thing, but that there was also sort of feminist movement building. So I wish I had gotten a chance to play just a clip for you, where many of our students, many of whom are international students, chopped it up about what feminism looks like in India in particular, and the way that they're trying to move conversations around rape culture there. So thank you for that.
I wanted to.
You talked of intersectionality so much. That's also a language that I come from women's studies, so I also use it. All the students are using. But I think it's misleading. I think stratification is much more powerful. You know, we are so stratified by class, by caste, by yes, class and caste. And so when you say intersectionality, it's a sophisticated way of discussing what we are now considering as stratification, because for caste and class, we are now using the word stratification amongst the feminist conversations. I just wondered how you react to that.
Let me take so I'm actually a real big proponent of not erasing intersectionality, because there seems to be a misunderstanding about, not a misunderstanding of the concept, but a misuse of what it means. So I think it's Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of power. I don't just think it's about identity politics. So it's the difference between talking about race, class, and gender intersecting and talking about racism, classism, and capitalism intersecting, right? And so when Kimberly Crenshaw wrote about intersectionality and the sort of immediate years after, she was talking about how systems of power work to disadvantage particular groups. And now we have made it in feminist theory a whole conversation about how I am a collection of many different identities. But that sort of wasn't the project. So I agree with the move that you're making, which is to point us again to power structures and how they differentially give us access to resources. But I also think that part of what we have to do in our work in feminist political media can do better at this is helping us to remember when concepts travel well and when they don't. And sometimes intersectionality doesn't always capture the intricacies of other geopolitical sort of situations and environments. I mean, I think that's okay to say without then jettisoning it as a really important way of thinking about power, particularly in the US and then some places that have race and class stratification that looks like ours.
Hi, I'm Jeannie. I'm a media consumer. I'm a mom, I'm a sister, I'm a business owner. And I thought this, I'm not sure if this is a question or a declaration, but as a media consumer and a person who reads and really admires all this really provocative discussion, I guess the question I struggle with is, how do you keep the dialogue alive? And being that you're putting out all of this thought and just really powerful discussion. That's where I struggle. I haven't really watched the news, frankly, since the election. It bummed me out so much. And I live in a pretty Republican area. I'm Irish Catholic as they come. You know, that's kind of the way it goes. And I just really struggled with it. And what I find really tough is to have constructive dialogue, because I feel like everybody's made their decision and they're going to stay on that side of the fence. So what we do is we kind of put our head in the sand and say, well, we're not going to talk about it. And what I loved about this is that you're keeping this discussion. It's so powerful. Even if we don't agree, it's still constructive. So I guess my question back to you is, how could we all do that in a way to keep that conversation alive? And I thought it was a great follow-up to your point that just came up. So that's my question for thought, if we could put that out there.
Yes, so there's actually some amazing work being done by organizations like Hollaback and the Dinner Party, where they are creating grassroots dinner conversations around the country for people to come together, for others who are seeking to have dinner, who might come from different political persuasions, different backgrounds from you in your area, and they will connect you to have conversations. And there's been some beautiful coverage of it in the New York Times and some other places if you want to kind of check out what it's like to see, to talk about how people came to the conversations, at what point did they end up or not talking about politics, but really just learning how each other feels about all sorts of different things we experience in life as humans, and coming to see each other differently, and coming to also realize where they were making assumptions about how the other side feels. And I think that work is really important and really beautiful. And I think that we can also facilitate those sorts of dialogues in our lives organically with that sort of model. Another thing I think is really interesting is I'm really learning now to sometimes think about the people who engage me on social media, if you're doing that, who might disagree. And sometimes it's a discernment of, you know, whether or not this is someone I can feel safe enough and trusting with and having a conversation. But I've been pleasantly surprised recently with some people who I've realized that I actually don't see things quite differently from. It's just there's a specific vantage point different or something like that needs to be expressed, or some point of misinformation that could be disconnecting us on an issue. And so I have been trying, when I have the time, to engage more, to sometimes engage in dialogues that people are setting up online. Message boards are not for everyone, but I am finding myself wanting to do that, sometimes as an observer, to kind of understand how other people are thinking, and to really understand. When I did do that CNN appearance, I got several emails from Trump-supporting, Fox-viewing women who thanked me for speaking out about Bill O'Reilly. And that was amazing. One of the people told me he was a vet who had been in Iraq and also in Desert Storm, and that he said that I had taught him something, because I said one point, which was when the host said, Well, Bill O'Reilly is saying that these claims are unfounded. What do you say to people who say it's unfounded? I said, oh, well, that's typical abuser behavior, gaslighting, harassing, intimidating you into thinking that your claims are not okay, and that's typically done to women and other oppressed people. And so that person said, oh, I've actually seen that in the military. I've seen that in other places. You taught me something. So I think that by putting ourselves out there, although it's not always comfortable, we can be surprised about who we may touch and who we may reach.
Can I also follow up on that a little bit, which is that unfortunately, the things to do, and I think this is in part echoing what Jamia is saying, I would urge you to watch the news. And it's horrible. And I often, I often wish that I didn't have to watch it for my job. And during the sort of blank months that are November and December for me, where I can't remember a lot, I do remember saying many times, I wish I didn't have to look, right? So I really get why you don't want to. But one of the tasks in front of all of us is to not look away. And if the news, in whatever form you are watching it, is too much, if you liked this conversation, read Crunk, right?
Yes.
Read Brittney. Right? Read Jamia and me. Read the people who are in this room. If you want an easier entry, like something where you like what we're talking about, what we're saying, go in that way, through a path where you're hearing voices and arguments that interest you rather than just upset you, right? And then the other thing, which is I think what Jamia is saying, is if you're living in a community where it feels like it's right-wing, conservative, Trump supporting, I think there's a very high chance that that's not uniformly true. And also, sometimes rather than approaching it as combat, which I think is how a lot of these we think, oh my God, we're going to have the fight, sometimes it's the hard thing of just saying what you think in a room where you suspect that maybe nobody else thinks the same thing, but saying it with confidence. And it's not about I'm going to ask you to think all the same things, but here's what I think. And you never know when someone in that room either is going to say, oh my God, there's somebody else who agrees with me, or who's just roused to curiosity about like, oh, I like her, she's my neighbor, she's my friend, she's my cousin, and she thinks differently. I'm curious about why. So sometimes it's not about entering it as if it's going to be a battle, but rather that you're letting people know who you are and what's important to you, and you're doing it with confidence, knowing that they might not agree with you, and that's okay. But you're going to be vocal about it, because one of the keys to social progress, especially when it comes to women throughout American history, is women actually finding ways to communicate with each other. Because one of the ways that women have been cut off from power is that they've been isolated in these places, in communities, in homes, in domestic spaces. In the 19th century, when they came together in religious revivals or in factories and mills and in schools, as education became more possible, they started to talk to each other. And that's part of what gives birth to an abolitionist movement, a suffrage movement, a labor movement, the settlement house movement, is women actually finding their voices and talking to each other outside of the places they've been walled off. And that's part of what you're describing right now is a community in which it sounds like you feel walled off. But the mere act of talking about what you think might in fact be explosive for a woman who lives 6 blocks from you and says, oh my God, her too. And then you could talk together, and then the possibility there is really endless. And a lot of what you're seeing in Georgia, the John Ossoff race, the suburban women in a red district, I bet every one of those women would have told you 6 months ago, I live in a Republican district and nobody here agrees with me, right? And look, they came within 300 votes of electing a Democrat, and they might still do it, So, and that's about the fact that they started talking to each other. They were so mad, they started talking to each other. And it turned out that a lot of them felt that way. So, if you go, there are just different strategies that might make you feel more comfortable, but start letting people in your community know what you think.
We are out of time. Thank you.